Welcome to the third in a series of videos that looks at the starter characters of Genshin Impact, their constellations, and their utility in battle. For this video, we will be outlining an overview of Lisa Menchi, a powerful mage who not only studied in the Academy of Sumeru, but was the most prolific of all the students that had been there in over 200 years. Of course, when it comes to Genshin Impact and gacha games in general, we often need to separate the lore from game mechanics. However, we can always take the information available and push to make that lore just a little closer to the realm of possibility. Just like Kaya and Amber, Lisa's constellations are only available by wishing on the standard banner or by purchasing her Stella Fortuna with star glitter from the Paimon shop. And just like the other two videos, this guide will assume that you enjoy playing Lisa and wish to learn more about her and the utility her constellations have to offer. We're going to be taking a fairly unorthodox approach with this episode, but I suppose it is rather fitting considering Lisa is a rather unorthodox character. To start off, we need to talk about elemental reactions. This may seem like an odd place to start, but if you understand reactions, you understand Lisa's position in the game. Lisa is the first character in Genshin Impact and is currently the only Electro unit to possess Elemental Mastery as an Ascension stat. Electro has a lot of elemental reactions to choose from, so Lisa is typically seen as the game's teaching tool for learning transformative reactions. In early game, these reactions are fairly strong, but require more mindfulness and preparation to scale well in late game, which gave the perception that Lisa's Ascension stat more or less became irrelevant with time. With crit builds slowly becoming more worthwhile for investment and transformative reactions being incapable of scoring crit hits, elemental mastery and transformative reactions became more or less reserved to Animo units, since their utility with that stat in particular synergized very well with their specific 4-piece set, the Viridescent Venerer. Despite being incapable of scoring crit hits, Animo units were special in that Swirl was capable of chain reacting both transformative and amplifying reactions. So it's not like people dislike transformative reactions per se, it's just that they don't really like them when triggered by Electro characters. There are various enemies in Genshin Impact that mitigate or even null specific elemental damage entirely. As a Catalyst wielder, Lisa is only capable of dealing Electro damage. This means matchups against Electro elementals will render all her damage inert. In addition, Electro usually deals AoE reaction damage that matches the element it interacts with. When Electro meets Pyro, for instance, it simply deals AoE Pyro damage. Against groups of Pyro elementals, this leaves Lisa's raw damage to do all the work. These are the usual arguments presented when people peg Electro as the weakest element. Even those that do build an Electro character for full mastery need to be mindful of timing to ensure their mastery character is the one triggering the reactions. Electro reactions work well against normal enemies or when elemental enemy types are varied, but the spread of elemental damage does not apply that elemental aura, meaning that Electro reactions do not chain react. This is why Swirl, which spreads elemental aura, is seen as a better use of the elemental mastery stat. To put it plainly, many people find it perplexing that mastery is her ascension stat, when mastery isn't seen as reliable on Electro characters. This conversation extends to other Electro characters that gain passive benefits from mastery as well, but to get to the point, the relevance of Lisa's ascension stat is to be treated as icing on the cake. In early game, she does well with building for attack and using mastery set bonuses to do equal parts of both damage types. Early game sets like the Instructor come to mind, and it can be combined with Wanderers just a while after. For weapons, you can embrace crit rate with a twin Nephrite, which can be found in chests in Liyue. Otherwise, the 3-star Magic Guide or the 4-star craftable Mappa Mare are good standard choices for Lisa at lower AR. They both have their own unique way of offering bonus damage, and since early AR enemies have low HP, the mastery granted will make sure your reaction damage really hurts. Now, even though the minimal investment to mastery doesn't scale too well at higher world levels, Lisa's overall utility isn't very much bothered by minimal mastery investment. You could say that in a similar vein to Lisa, it has untapped potential that's being stored away for later. Now, if you are interested in building a full mastery Lisa, your best bet is building around her elemental burst. The Lightning Rose is a large lantern that deals AoE Electro damage. The Lightning Rose will carry any buffs Lisa had on her at the time of cast, and will keep those buffs even if they're no longer affecting Lisa herself. For full mastery Lisa, you'll want an elemental mastery main stat for your goblet and circlet. For reasons we'll discuss later, you may find that Lisa's uptime can be a little on the difficult side to maintain. Your mastery pieces will need good energy recharge substats, and you'll likely need energy recharge sands with plenty of mastery ones. Thanks to her ascension stat being more or less half of that of a main stat piece, the burden of getting higher mastery substats is eased up a little. Realistically speaking, you could probably push for 800 points of mastery without a mastery substat weapon, but any higher than that would be fairly difficult to achieve on her own. If you choose to ease some of your energy troubles with a Favonius Codex, do keep in mind you'll need decent crit rate substats as well in order to gain its effect. For mastery builds, it is rather tempting to use a full set of Thundering Fury, but I don't think it's necessary. At some point, a 40% reaction damage bonus that adds to the bonus already granted by your mastery might be better than adding mastery itself, but it's pretty hard to hit that point. And at that rate, the 4-piece effect of Thundering Fury could very well be replaced by any 2-piece effect that adds 80 mastery. With a released Emblem of Severed Fate set, the small dip in reaction damage is negligible, and honestly it's made up for by more burst consistency. However, that choice is still very much in your hands. Now you might be thinking it's a lot of hassle to use a full mastery build, but the reason she's so dependent on her burst is because you may find that Lisa is far too quick to apply Electro Aura and is unable to consistently trigger reactions while she's the star player. This usually means that full mastery Lisa is more than likely going to be working from the background. If you're looking for an on-field option for Lisa, we can discuss that option later, but otherwise you may need to invest in crit builds instead. That said, Lisa's burst is very flexible. It allows her to work both offensively as well as provide support for her entire team. When Lisa's 4th Ascension is unlocked, her passive static electricity field will reduce the defense of all enemies hit by lightning rose by 15%. Because of how damage is dealt in this game, there are 2 separate damage mitigators, defense and resistance. Most means of reducing damage mitigators usually only target enemy resistance, but Lisa is one of the few characters that can lower defense itself, thereby multiplying the effects of any resistance shred being performed in your team. Because of this, Lisa can easily use the Noblesse Oblige set to increase the attack of her team after casting her elemental burst. You can use the standard modified crit build of Energy Recharge Sands, Electro Goblet, and Crit Circlet. On the subject of weapons, if you truly want to use Lisa for support, you can replace the Favonius Codex with the Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers, which provides an attack bonus to the character you swap to after Lisa leaves the field. The HP stat isn't used to enhance Lisa's capabilities, but the passive of the book is great to use in tandem with the Noblesse set. And if you're a big fan of using Eula, Lisa provides the other half of Superconduct, which increases physical damage, effectively killing 2 birds with 1 stone. If you prefer the offensive route, the Severed Fate set strikes again. Otherwise, you can increase this portion of her damage using 2 pieces of Thundering Fury and 2 pieces of the Noblesse Oblige, if you don't mind losing burst consistency. Though at higher AR, the increased demand for energy might make the emblem set the better choice to allow her multiple instances of damage to add up. And speaking of adding up, Lisa's 4th constellation, Plasma Eruption, will increase the ticks of damage performed by the Lightning Rose and add to her overall DPS. It's more effective the more enemies surround you, so keep that in mind. Now, if you want Lisa to step outside the shadows and take center stage, we'll need to explore another conversation about Electro. Even though many Electro units do have some impressive damage scaling, DPS characters aren't typically graded on their scaling alone. A lot of the most widely used top-tier damage dealers are often boosted through amplifying reactions, since they not only double the damage your DPS would normally do, they can benefit from crit too. This is why so many meta build commentators are so hesitant to suggest building Kazuha for crit. Even though he does really nice damage thanks to his talent scaling, the fact that his personal damage can't be further amplified with reactions makes him slower than more other favorable units, and they'd rather he play on the side of support and allow chain reactions to serve your damage makeup. Well, if you feel like that puts Lisa in an odd spot, fear not, there are plenty of more or less meta teams that don't or can't exactly rely on amp damage, and freeze teams are a really good example of that. Just like how Kaya really thrives in freeze teams, which don't really use their reaction to amplify damage so much as control the tide of battle, Lisa has a team type that can really put a shock to your system. A lot of people from early game will look at Overloaded, the combination of Electro and Pyro, and go, wow, that's a lot of damage, and think that that's the best Electro reaction, and I used to be one of them. However, over time I think I've come to appreciate Electro Charged. The instances of damage are never going to be higher than that of Overloaded, but what isn't obvious at first glance is that Electrocharge deals more instances of damage at once, and it does so very frequently. And after noticing that, it makes Overloaded feel so much slower by comparison. Lisa has other teams that she works well in, but I think she really thrives in Electrocharge teams. It's colloquially referred to as Taser, but I don't typically use it myself. If you're out in the wild and you hear that term a lot though, this is what they're referring to. At any rate, Lisa in an Electrocharge team is going to require rapid Hydro applicators. You can always use her burst and swap to a Hydro main DPS, but if you want an on-field Lisa, options like Yelan and Xingqiu have merit. Even though this is a reaction team and those reactions do add up, it's hard to predict exactly who will be triggering the reaction at any time. This is mostly because Electrocharge is one of the few reactions that can contain coexisting elemental auras. So even in this team, it's best to treat Elemental Mastery as extra rather than the bulk of the damage. Since Hydro applications such as Xingqiu and Yelan are locked behind their bursts and require normal attack inputs to trigger, we don't want to waste any precious time once Lisa hits the field. This means we're going to be relying an awful lot on the damage of her basic attack, Lightning Touch. The damage multipliers are relatively low, but the attack string is fairly rapid. We can also remedy the issue of her normal attack strings by weaving in her elemental skill to help boost the damage output. But let's not get too ahead of ourselves. As Electrocharged allows for a coexisting elemental auras, the most effective set for this style of play is definitely the Thunder Soother. It also works fairly well with Mono Electro, a team that makes use of Electro and Swirl to maximize Electro damage and allow Electro wielders to utilize the full scope of the damage. This set always seems to fly under most people's radars, but I assure you that for those particular team lineups, this set is actually pretty amazing and doesn't deserve being snubbed as much as it is. The 2-piece effect increases resistance to Electro, but the 4-piece effect improves all damage against enemies with an Electro aura, regardless of the element of the damage you are dealing. So even Hydro units could benefit from this set in Electrocharged teams. Granted, the Hydro units we've previously mentioned have better sets to choose from, but it's still worth mentioning nonetheless that early game Hydro had more options than originally perceived. The Thunder Soother has a 4-star version available starting at Adventure Rank 35. Even lower AR will have to settle for the Instructor set. Even though it's hard to predict who will be triggering Electrocharged at any given time, Lisa is going to be one of them at some point, and the 4-piece effect increases the entire team's elemental mastery upon triggering a reaction. So at that point, it really doesn't matter who's triggering the reaction, everyone will equally benefit from the reaction damage. For weapons, we can harken back to the Magic Guide in Mappa Mara, but if you feel like sharing the love, you can also use the Hakushin Ring. It's got energy recharge, so it might fit better for support Lisa, but when she is on the field and triggering elemental reactions, she improves the elemental damage of all party members whose element contributed to that reaction. Another great option for Electrocharged is the Lost Prayer. It grants elemental damage bonus, but it requires the user to be on the field to benefit from them. This is a weapon you only give to a character you really like and want to play actively. It's not good for off-field play except for the crit substats, so if Lisa isn't the star of the show, it's probably better to save that weapon for someone else. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Lisa's combo attacks aren't particularly strong, however, her charged attack is fairly mighty. If you really enjoy performing charged attacks, you can opt for 4-piece Wanderers at higher adventure rank and 4-piece Sojourners at lower. That being said, this may not necessarily be her best option, and that has very much to do with what we haven't yet talked about. When Lisa has access to her first Ascension passive Induced Aftershock, hits from her charged attack add a stack of Conductive status. This is Genshin's first fairly technical skill element, and it's very interesting to look at in detail. Stacks of the conductive status are predominantly mentioned in her elemental skill, and that is the first and foremost method of distributing them. Every time you tap Lisa's skill Violet Arc, she sends out a small homing ball of electricity that marks her target with a number that represents the stack applied, up to a maximum of 3. The scaling on her tapped Violet Arc is higher than Lisa's normal attack combo, and the cooldown is a singular second. This makes it great for weaving in your attacks in Electrocharged teams. And the weapon domain in Mondstadt? The doubled cooldown is almost negligible. Lisa absolutely dominates that domain. In all seriousness, its spammability allows lower AR players an array of options. This means that the Solar Pearl is also an excellent choice for Electrocharged teams because constantly weaving your tap skill into your normal attack combos ensures that both damage types gain bonus damage. If you're at lower AR, the Gambler set further increases skill damage by 20%. That's pretty amazing on its own, but at slightly higher AR, you can add in 2 Thundering Fury for a total of 35%. No aura condition required. You will have to settle for other aspects of Lisa's damage to be lower, but at low AR, that's a sizable damage increase from a set bonus. Speaking of sizable, the purpose of the conductive stacks isn't just to be flashy. Lisa's skill can also be held, and as you might suspect, the held version deals far more damage. And for each stack of conductive status on her foe, that damage goes up even higher. Now, some people do believe that Lisa's charge skill is way too slow. I do concede it takes a bit of time to charge up, but I also know that a lot of players are led to believe they have to charge Lisa's skill until she detonates it herself. The truth of the matter is, her elemental skill can be released early. Upon casting the charge skill, you will see a faint purple outline that surrounds Lisa. This is the maximum range of her Violet Arc. Inside that outline is a separate ring that grows in size. At just under 2 seconds of charging her skill, that inner ring will grow to match the outer one. When it does, it's safe to release the skill. The extra time allowed to hold the skill is just to allow players to wait for more targets to enter her fearsome downburst of thunder, and this is probably for the best. What you may have noticed is that Lisa cannot generate particles with her tap skill. Her elemental skill has an almost yin-yang effect. Only the held skill will generate particles, but the tap version has an almost non-existent cooldown. So even though she generates a generous number of particles, it will be a while before she can do so again. Her first constellation, Infinite Circuit, will give Lisa a flat increase of 2 energy per enemy hit by her charged Violet Arc, up to a maximum of 5 opponents. And if you're worried about getting interrupted while charging your Violet Arc, you may be interested in knowing that Lisa's second constellation, Electromagnetic Field, increases her defense and her resistance to interruption, so you can still rain down thunderous retribution after tanking a few hits. Without constellations though, it will be a matter of maintaining a degree of spatial awareness. If you're familiar with playing Amber, you may already be adjusted to this principal mindset. So assuming Violet Arc looks very appealing to you and you're excited to lean into this aspect of play, you might be thinking it takes too long to set up. The good news is that this is rather deceptive. Each time the tapped Violet Arc marks a target with a stack of the conductive status, any enemy within a small area of the marked target will also be marked. If the tapped Violet Arc triggers an elemental reaction, then the amount of stacks will increase. There's a lot of technical information about how proximity, the type of reaction triggered, and how many enemies are grouped together affect the level of stacks added. In simplest terms, the more enemies you have grouped together while triggering a reaction with your tapped Violet Arc, the better your odds are of immediately applying multiple stacks to the whole lot of them. Of course, while it is very exciting to see the maximum payoff for your charged Violet Arc stacks, it won't always be feasible and you will need to settle for less. Sometimes it's just better to perform it with no stacks of conductive status. Small word of warning, if you and a friend both play Lisa, be sure to communicate to each other whose turn it is to use all the stacks you've accumulated together, because when one Lisa uses the charged Violet Arc, it clears all stacks on the hit enemies built up by the other. That said, if you really like Lisa, love the damage scaling of her charged Violet Arc attack, and want to eventually get into the habit of just summoning her on occasion to deal tremendous amounts of burst damage, her 6th constellation is Pulsating Witch, and it applies 3 stacks of conductive status automatically when she takes to the field. The effect has a 5-second cooldown, but it really doesn't matter since the cooldown of her charge skill is even longer. You could technically use the 4-piece effect of Thundering Fury to mitigate this, but honestly that's the only thing you'd be using this 4-piece effect for. If you've still got a few seconds left of whatever buff you've given to Lisa, use her charged attack and follow it up with Lightning Rose before it expires. To make the most of this aspect of Lisa, I'm sorry to say that higher AR doesn't have the same double dipping as lower AR. Many of you will have to settle for 2 pieces of Thundering Fury and any set that grants plus 18% attack. If you're running Mono Electro and you're making good use of Anemo Shred and Kujo Sara, you can take advantage of what I mentioned before and use Thunder Soother. That said, there may be one more set that would be interesting to have a look at. With the introduction of Dendro, we have a few more reactions to look at. The first one is Hyperbloom. When Dendro and Hydro react, they create a Bloom Seed. You could apply Electro to deal Dendro reaction damage that scales with the Electro wielder's mastery. It's still transformative reaction damage, which means her burst is more than welcome, but due to the nature of the Dendro core, Lisa doesn't have to worry about missing the timing of the reaction, which allows her to take to the front seat and drive the reaction damage, thus giving players the option to play full Mastery Lisa as the star of the show. As for the other reactions that have been introduced, it might potentially allow a new set to benefit Lisa once more for building crit and gaining Mastery set bonuses. When Dendro meets Electro, it triggers the Quicken reaction. This is a debuff that weakens enemy resistance to both Dendro and Electro. Provided no other reactions interfere, when either Dendro or Electro damage is dealt to the weakened enemy, they are granted bonus damage in the form of a flat talent buff that scales with the damage dealer's elemental mastery. This means we can make use of the new Gilded Dream set. The 2-piece provides 80 elemental mastery, and the 4-piece provides an attack buff for each character that shares the wearer's element, and simultaneously provides 50 elemental mastery for each different element your team comprises of, up to a maximum of 150. At level 90, Lisa has an innate elemental mastery of 94. With this set and the right team lineup, she gets an additional 230 with no effort required. She'll lose out on the 15% damage bonus from 2-piece Thundering Fury, but when you think about it, this set will still allow her the typical crit build, she'll still have access to an Electro Goblet, and the bonus damage she receives will more than make up for it. If you want to optimize your damage dealing though, it's good to remember that a flat talent buff is only affected by your bonus damage and crit chance. Even if your talents themselves are at level 1, The damage enhancement gifted by the reaction will always remain the same. This means that the more times you can trigger the reaction, the better, which means C4 Lisa's burst is still the most ideal way to take advantage of the Quicken status. That said, Quicken still allows Lisa to take a more prominent role up front, and with a lot of investment into bonuses for her elemental skill, it can make her skill damage even more mighty than it already is. Dendro reactions definitely open up more possibilities and flexibility, and no weapon screams flexibility more than the Widsith. It is the 1 4-star catalyst that no one can ever shut up about, but that's only because its passive is really amazing. It's like the Rust of catalysts. It oftentimes beats out 5-star options, other times it's still pretty good. Whenever the equipped character takes to the stage, they get one of the 3 buffs, symbolized by a musical note that appears above their head. One note represents the first buff, which increases their attack. At full refinement, that's 120%, which is insane. The second buff, represented by 2 notes, increases elemental damage. At full refinement, it grants 90% elemental damage, which is more than what fully refined 5 stars give. And finally, symbolized by 3 notes, we have the Elemental Mastery buff. At full refinement, it is a whopping 480. A lot of guide creators couldn't care less for this buff, but I honestly think it's pretty solid, especially in Electrocharged, Hyperbloom, and Quicken teams. On certain characters, it feels pretty hard to lose on this weapon, and I think Lisa is one of them. Second only to Yaemiko, whose passive directly benefits from Elemental Mastery buffs. And speaking of Yaemiko, I guess we can finally segue to the Kagura's Verity. This beautiful masterpiece was designed specifically to cater to Yaemiko's playstyle, which is to summon a bunch of Electro Totems and vanish from sight. Ideally, you want to use all 3 charges of her skill before doing so. This weapon's only job is to increase skill damage. Each time a skill is used, it grants a small buff to your skill, and it can stack up to 3 times. With full stacks, the weapon piles on an additional elemental bonus damage. So while I don't think this weapon is well suited for every aspect of Lisa's damage output, the sheer fact that Lisa's skill damage is granted a 48% damage bonus with no refinements makes this a solid choice for skill damage Lisa. If that isn't your cup of tea, you can still fall back on the Widsith because the bonuses from the passive stick around even if she leaves the field. My only word of caution is that the Widsith requires you to control at least 2 characters to work. This weapon is not multiplayer friendly unless you're the host and only invite 2 friends max to your world. So I think that about covers it. Lisa's range of utility is quite fearsome, just as she is. So, as I have done before, I will show a chart showing all of her weapon options and how they fit into her different playstyles. You can pause the screen or take a look at the link in the description below. As for artifacts, I'll flash a couple of the build ideas I mentioned before and the team compositions they benefit from. I'll include this information in the description as well. This is one of the longer videos that I've made so far, but I hope it was worth it in the end. I think Lisa is often overlooked, and if she doesn't mesh with your preferred playstyle, fair enough. But I hope that anyone who likes her and wants to play her will enjoy this guide and have a good idea of what they're getting themselves into. Circling back to how this video started, I think it's rather fitting that the star student from Sumeru's academia is able to maintain her Ascension stats relevance at higher AR through the new Dendro reactions. Perhaps this was always the plan, and Lisa was always meant to be designed with Sumeru and Dendro in mind. Who knows? But she definitely has a good number of set options for her different styles of play. So that will do it for this video. If you enjoy Lisa, tell me how you plan to build her in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. I'll see you in the next video, so until then, stay tuned.